How well do you think you know Indigenous and cross-cultural psychology? For those of you that were raised in a Western culture and are studying this, in case you haven't realized yet, we need to understand that Western culture is not a universal normal and never has been. So by understanding Indigenous and cross-cultural psychology, you will gain a much deeper appreciation for what culture really is, as well as gaining a third-person perspective on cultural norms. So it's a very powerful perspective to have on the world once you have the accumulated knowledge from these specific areas. So let's begin. Question 1. A psychologist fails to accept the differences in child-rearing practices in Aboriginal communities as compared to Western practices and wrongly claims neglect. This is best described by concept equivalence, critical self-awareness, enculturation, or cultural encapsulation. So, the answer is cultural encapsulation. So, let's walk through all of these terms so you understand why cultural encapsulation is the answer. So, concept equivalence. This can be referred to as cultural equivalence, defined as having an analogous meaning and relevance of the constructs in two cultures. So this is definitely not concept equivalence. There's neglect being claimed here, and it's wrong. The conclusion is wrong. That's the main thing. So there's no equivalence. So critical self-awareness. In philosophy of self-awareness is the experience of one's own personality or individuality. It is not to be confused with consciousness in the sense of qualia, whatever that is. While consciousness is being aware of one's environment, body, and lifestyle, self-awareness is the recognition of awareness. I mainly highlighted the yellow bit. That's the most important thing to understand here, is that self-awareness is how an individual consciously knows and understands their own character, feelings, motives, and desires. This question has nothing to do with any of that. It's completely irrelevant. Okay, enculturation. This is an umbrella term that refers to how an individual attains the cultural norms of their heritage culture. Again, absolutely nothing to do with what's going on. So cultural encapsulation is the lack of understanding, ignorance of another's cultural background, the influence this background has on one's current view of the world. And that is exactly what has happened here. This psychologist thinks that they just know everything, and the fact that there are different cultures to consider is just irrelevant, that there is a set understanding to have through every individual. And in making this assumption, this psychologist is just ignoring a lot of things. It's just encapsulating this idea. The psychologist is not being open-minded. They're not being free or accepting of other ideas. They've just set that this is exactly how the way it's supposed to go, and there is no other alternative. So it's cultural encapsulation. All right, next question. So W.H.R. Rivers' result of their study involving the Molellar Illusion, the hypothesis, and they also the assumption of cultural superiority of English participants. Which one is it? In case you're not aware of the Molellar Illusion, there was this guy, I think it was probably 1900s, or 18th century, somewhere in the vicinity of the last 300 years, this person thought that people who were not aligned with Western culture, people who still, lived in a sort of hunter-gatherer aspect, or who did not align with the Western ideology of life, were considered savages, were considered inferior. And to prove this guy made up an illusion where is it? Surely I haven't... Oh, there's the answer. Whoops. So essentially, this is the Molellar Illusion, if you haven't heard of it, where there's two lines and they're the same length. But when the Molellar Illusion was shown to a specific group of people, it was found that they were just not susceptible to be fooled by this illusion, so they're not exactly inferior to Western people. So essentially, I pretty much explained the answer, but hopefully pause the video on how to guess at it anyway. So let's have a look at, what I wrote here 1 week ago. So the Himba people. The first hints that modernization could change our vision came from the Victorian anthropologist W.H.R. Rivers, who explored the islands of the Torres Strait between Australia and Papua New Guinea in the turn of the 20th century. As he met the locals, he offered them various sensory tests, including the following phenomenon, known as the Molellar Illusion. So essentially, what this guy discovered, I actually think you guys need a little bit of context, just in case you're not aware of the whole ideology of this guy, why he even went to these lengths. Let's just have a look at this in more detail. So as you know, the lines are exactly the same. And if you were to ask people to estimate their size, most Westerners would claim that the second line with the feathers pointing outwards is around 20% longer than the top line. During this expedition to the Torres Strait, however, Rivers found that the locals were far more accurate. They just didn't seem to be as susceptible to the illusion. The anthropologist later repeated the experiment on the Toda people of southern India, finding exactly the same result or effect, and the same result has since been found in many other pre-modern societies, including the San people of the Kalahari Desert. One theory is that the illusion results from the fact that modern humans spend more time indoors, lots of carpenting corners. If the angles along the edge of an object are out, an object is usually further away from us, like the distant wall of a room, whereas if the angles point inwards, it is usually closer to us, like the near side of a table. The brain has learnt to process this perspective rapidly, helping us to estimate size at distance, but in the case of the illusion, that brain processing backfires. Like an irregular lens, our modern urban brains distort the images, hitting our retina, magnifying some parts of the scene, and shrinking others. This was not supposed to be the result of the study. What Rivers was trying to prove was that they were a superior race, and he didn't actually prove that at all. He just essentially got us one step closer to understanding that all people are the same, no matter what colour their skin is. So I'm glad we've got people out there that are performing this experiment. But yeah, essentially, the study where the hypothesis was that these people would be more susceptible to these illusions was wrong, and it countered the assumption of cultural superiority of English participants. Important case study in psychology. Well, experiment. Question 3. Jonathan Metz found that during the 1960s, an increase in the diagnosis of young African Americans with schizophrenia was due to what? Physiological changes, psychological changes, changes to the diagnostic criteria, or sophistication diagnostic process? It's definitely not sophistication diagnostic process. It is, in fact, changes to the diagnostic criteria. You know, there's a lot to be said there, isn't there? We're going to move on to the next question. So the following, which is an example of Western epistemology? So is it knowledge is revealed and belongs to the group, can be used, shared but not owned? Yeah, that does not sound like Western epistemology. The status of power, the status of the knower is earned by a formal process. Sounds more like it. If you have a look at our process of learning, we have Kindu, pre-primary year 1 to year 12, we have university, we have titles of doctor and engineer and whatnot, so the status of the knower is earned by a formal process. Legitimacy is based on connected. Yeah, no, it is not. It doesn't matter how many friends you are. That doesn't mean you're legit. Your physical and spiritual nature of life, no one cares about any of this. To be connected is to know, and knowing is embodied and connected to. Yeah, no. I'm going to say it's B, and it is B, because it's the only one that makes sense. If you're not from a Western culture, I don't think that was the most in-depth or informative description of Western epistemology, but essentially what happens in our Western culture is that the status of the knower is earned by a formal process. It doesn't have anything to do by how the individual is connected to the nature, or how they look, or how many friends they are, or how well their relationships are. It's just earned by a formal process, which is, causing a lot of mental health issues. Okay, question 5. When considering Berry's 1974 psychological acculturation framework, there are 4 distinct acculturation orientations. These strategies are as following. So which one is it? I'll give you a second to read through them. Integration, assimilation, segregation, multiculturalism, separation and exclusion, etc., etc. The answer to this question you actually have to read up about Berry's, because there's specific definitions to each of these terms. So I'll run through them. The answer is C, integration, assimilation, separation, and marginalization. There we go. Got it out eventually. So let's have a look at some of the terms in here so we can understand why the answer is C. So acculturation is a process of social, psychological, and cultural change that stems from the balancing of 2 cultures while adapting to the prevailing culture of the society. Acculturation, why am I having trouble saying that? Acculturation, that's what is going to happen. That's how I'm going to say it. Is a process in which an individual adopts, acquires, and adjusts to a new culture environment as a result of being placed into a new culture when another culture is brought to you. Individuals of a different culture try to incorporate themselves into the new, more prevalent culture by participating in aspects of the more prevalent culture, such as their traditions, but still hold on to their original cultural values and traditions. The effects of acculturation can be seen multiple levels in both the devotee of the prevailing culture and those who are assimilating into the culture. So hopefully you understand what acculturation is. Acculturation, there we go. So models of acculturation. So culture shock and the stages of culture shock are part of the acculturation process. Scholars in different disciplines have developed more than 100 different theories of acculturation. However, contemporary research has primarily focused on different strategies and how acculturation affects individuals, as well as interventions to make the process easier. So as transport in our modern society becomes more prevalent, more accessible for everyone all over the globe, we start getting cultures mixing. And what happens when cultures mix can lead to culture shock. So what determines this culture shock? How does it occur is a very important question. So Berry's model of acculturation. Assimilation occurs when individuals adopt the cultural norms of a dominant or host culture over their original culture. So that's the first step. Then there is separation, when the individuals reject the dominant or host culture in favour of preserving the culture of origin. Separation is often facilitated by immigration to ethnic enclaves. Enclaves. We're settling on enclaves. Integration occurs when individuals are able to adopt the cultural norms of the dominant or host culture while maintaining the culture of origin. Integration leads to and is often synonymous with biculturalism. Marginalization occurs when individuals reject both their culture of origin and the dominant host culture. Now, unfortunately, what I've done is I've numbered it. This is not actually a process. This is a result. This is the 4 ways which acculturation can occur, and I'm pretty sure I included, there it is, the box. So there's 2 dimensions, and both can happen in either a negative or a positive way. So dimension 1 is relationship with the immigration country, and then relation with the own negative group. If they're both positive, so you're happy with your own culture and the new culture, then you just integrate with the new society. If you don't like your old culture, but you like the new culture, then you assimilate. If you really like your original culture but hate the new culture, then you just separate yourselves from this new culture. You go in your own little space and you don't bother anyone. You just want to be undisturbed. Marginalization is when you encounter a new culture, don't like it, and you don't like your old culture. So these are the different ways acculturation can occur. So hopefully, now that makes sense, Berry's model of acculturation, which is quite useful, I think. All right, question 6. Which of the following is an example of an Indigenous methodology? Reason is the apex of knowledge production. Status of knower is earned by formal process. Knowledge is revealed and belongs to the group. And traditional processes and practices underpin ritual and status around knowledge. Okay, the answer to this requires a bit of reading. You can't really deduce this from common sense. So knowledge is revealed and belongs to the group. All right, question 7. When it comes to Indigenous ontologies, which of the following is not correct? So again, this will require some reading. You can't really just deduce this if you don't have an understanding of what's going on. You need context to be able to understand this question. So the answer to this one is Indigenous ontological frameworks are hierarchical and provide an understanding of what constitutes reality. So the term culture, what is it best described as? History of an identified group of people who live in the same place. A set of common experiences that people from the same location all share, but it's probably not B. The good manners, stylish, no. Good manners, no. No. Definitely not. Okay. Identify groups of people who share common understandings, rituals, social regulations, religions, and place. I'm going to have to go with D. And it is correct. This is exactly what a culture is, best described. So implicit or tacit learning of cultural beliefs, values, and traditions is described as acculturation, cultural adaptation, acculturation, or culture shock. So implicit or tacit learning, for those who are unaware of this particular terminology, is when you learn through observation, and it's not particularly factual or descriptional learning. Like when you're learning maths, you learn a set number of steps, but implicit or tacit learning, it's sort of, you pick it up unconsciously in a way. So the way that you learn, this way of learning cultural beliefs is enculturation. So what is the difference between enculturation and acculturation? Gosh. Okay. Both enculturation and enculturation are processes of socialization taking place in a society. Those are what they have in common. But enculturation is a process that helps an individual, to imbibe social values, norms, customs of the culture he lives in. And acculturation is a two-way change process that takes place when there is a meeting of two cultures. So migration is a common example. So in acculturation, there are changes felt in both cultures. Though mostly it is the minority culture that gets changed by way of changed language, clothing, customs, and practices. And enculturation helps an individual to survive and better fit into the culture he finds himself surrounded in. Okay, question 10. First-generation migrants often attempt to retain elements of their culture, resulting in integration or separation from the host culture. Further, a lack of contact with the original culture can result in social security, social stability, the melting pot, or the stopped clock phenomenon. Well, hopefully you've read your textbook and know that it is the stopped clock phenomenon. Do I explain it? No, I go through everything. Okay, let's go through everything and then we'll talk about the stopped clock phenomenon. Social Security, in case you don't know, is just a program that provides people with retirement income and insurance, Medicare benefits, and disability payments. Social stability is the degree to which a society and its institution remain predictable and reliable. This is very important because it allows participants in society, such as individuals and groups, to plan and conduct their affairs without disruption. The melting pot. So the melting pot is a monocultural metaphor for a heterogeneous society becoming more homogeneous, the different elements melting together with a common culture, or an alternative being a homogeneous society becoming more heterogeneous through the influx of foreign elements with different cultural backgrounds, possessing the potential to create disharmony with the previous culture. Historically, it is often used to describe the cultural integration of immigrants to the United States. The melting pot theory is the idea that different cultures and ideas will blend together. The melting pot theory is the idea that different cultures and ideas will blend together and create one ultimate culture or idea. So that's the melting pot. There is another term called the mixed salad, which wasn't in the question, but it's good to provide contrast. So that in a mixed salad, many different cultures are thrown together, but little blending. Each culture just stands out. There's not much understanding going on. The melting pot, there's an assimilation of multiple cultures into a new blended American culture. For example, using the immigration as an example here. Alright, the stop clock phenomenon. The first generation migrants often attempt to retain elements of their culture, resulting in an integration separation from the host culture. Further, a lack of contact with their original culture can result in the stopped clock phenomenon. So I don't think it's well explained here, but essentially when someone migrates from their country, they are cut off from the development of that culture. So the person they are now, all the cultures that they believe in, all of their beliefs, are what was true for a certain period of time in that culture. But because they've disconnected from the ongoing changes in that culture, they have essentially preserved or paused their understanding at a particular moment, which is why it's called the stop clock phenomenon. Question 11. Integration is to multiculturalism as assimilation is to the melting pot, segregation is to exclusion, separation is to multiculturalism, and marginalization is to segregation. So the answer is assimilation is to the melting pot. Now, I had a little bit of trouble with this question, so I'm going to explain it out loud and hopefully gain some understanding what's going on. So integration, if we're referring to Berry's model, is when we have both positive aspects in the dimensions. So assimilation is essentially, yes, there is the culture integrated, there's an agreement, they're both positive dimensions. Oh yeah, because the melting pot, that's what they're trying to do is combine all the cultures as one, which is multiculturalism. Well, that is the same thing here, but we need to also consider separation. Alright, I see where they're coming from. This is a bit of a tricky question, does require a bit of explaining, but this does make sense. Assimilation is to the melting pot as integration is to multiculturalism. Alright, I explain it. Cultural assimilation is the process in which a minority group or culture comes to resemble a society's majority group or assume the values, behaviours and beliefs of another group, whether fully or partially. An integration occurs when individuals are able to adopt the cultural norms of the dominant host culture while maintaining the culture of origin. Integration leads to and is often synonymous with biculturalism. Alright, question 12. Researchers on the Human Genome Project conclude about the genetic basis of race that... This is a very good thing that I hope that one day everyone will know by heart, and that is that DNA studies do not show that separate races exist within modern humans. Thank you, Human Genome Project. Question 13. A focus on specific psychological aspects of a culture is a or an perspective, emic, etic, multicultural, or assimilationist. The answer is emic. So emic, this is a perspective from within the social group, from the perspective of the subject, and etic from the outside, from the perspective of the observer. Question 14. If you observe a client who shows a lack of eye contact in a cross-cultural setting, this could indicate either shyness, relative social status, respect, or it could be all of the above. And the answer is all of the above. You just don't know. It could be any of these. Keyword is could. Question 15. Acknowledging that psychologists work in diverse cultural contexts with a diverse range of clients and colleagues, and that psychologists need to be able to have flexibility in these situations. Well, if you've ever played sports, you know that this sort of sounds like agility. So yes, being able to switch between cultural contexts is cultural agility. Pretty sure this is the final question. So Sarah's family were immigrants from Vietnam, and when they arrived in Australia, they changed their first names to Australian names, stopped speaking Vietnamese, and adopted many Australian traditions like attending Anzac Day and watching the Sydney to Hobart yacht race. According to Berry's psychological acculturation framework, Sarah's family have assimilated. So if you have a look here, they did not like their culture in Vietnam, but they like the new culture, so they've assimilated. And that's it. So hopefully you have gained a deeper understanding of cross-cultural psychology and Indigenous psychology, and I hope this has helped you study for your exam or just general knowledge. Thanks for listening.